Well, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, but of course he needs no introduction. Arthur Dobrin has been a leader here for 33 years, from 1968 until his retirement in 2001. Uh, Arthur spent 2 years in Kenya as a Peace Corps volunteer along with his wife Lynn, and they joined the ethical movement in the mid 1960s. And Lynn, of course, is also a beloved and longtime member. Arthur taught humanities at Hofstra University since 1989 and recently retired as Professor Emeritus of University Studies. So he is double emeritus. He's Leader Emeritus here and Professor Emeritus there. He's the author of some 25 books. The most recent, Spiritual Timber, was published by the American Ethical Union last December. The Society is sponsoring a three-part discussion group over one of his recent books, Where We Started, which is about racial history in America, and his books, Spelling God with Two O's, have become classics around the entire ethical culture movement. So there's no better person who can talk about the history of ethical culture and the history of the Long Island Society than Arthur, a pillar of the society. So Arthur, welcome to the platform.
Thank you. So how did I get involved in the society? Well, in 1967, I was married, I was a father, and I was living in East Africa with the Peace Corps in Kenya, and saw an advertisement for the ethical movement. It was really a job placement advertisement. And what it said is that if you were interested in community development, education, children, and it may have listed one or two other things. It says, contact the American Ethical Union. Well, I never heard of it before. And the Ethical Culture Society is really very vaguely, very tangentially, but I liked everything that it said there. So I wrote, and we had some correspondence back and forth. And when I came home, I had an interview. And from that advertisement, my life was changed in a very different direction than what I had thought. I thought I would be living a life of an academic in some university somewhere or other. Never knew that there was such a career opportunity, a profession that would offer me the opportunity to do all the things that I had dreamed of doing. This seemed like an absolutely dream job for me. So in April of 1967, I had an interview at the American Ethical Union office in New York Society, which was housed at the New York Society. And in the interview, it went really, really, really well. And at the very end, someone asked me a question. And the question was, what do you feel about officiating at funerals? And I was really taken aback by that. Nowhere in the advertisement did it talk about pastoral duties. It didn't talk about funerals, didn't talk about that. Everything said to me was very, very positive. This didn't seem, I didn't want to do this. And my answer was, I really don't know. And at the end of the interview, I said, give me a week or so to think about this. I'm not sure this is something I want to do. Now, the position wasn't for leader, it was for a leader in training. But I still needed to think about it. Here I was married, had a child, had no other job prospects. What was I to do? And what was being offered as a salary, probably more accurately be described as a stipend. How in the world was I going to manage on that? Nevertheless, it was so attractive to me that this is really what I wanted to do. And I began to think about this and reconfigure it in my head. And at that point, what they said is, okay, well, there are three possibilities for you as a trainee. One is you can go to San Francisco, where you can start a new society. You can go to Baltimore, which doesn't have a leader. It's a small society. And you could serve essentially as the leader while you're a trainee. Or you could come to Long Island, which is a substantial society, and you would work under the supervision of the leader of the Long Island Society. They said, we're not going to send you to San Francisco. we have no idea whether you're capable of starting something. It doesn't even exist. We don't want to send you to Baltimore because who is going to supervise you? So they really narrowed it down to Long Island, which is, I never expected. I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in Queens, and I was back on Long Island. So it kept me close to home, and it kept me under the supervision of an established leader. Well, in 1968, which you probably got from the video, and some of you may actually remember this, your own personal recollections, it was a very contentious time, including within the society. The video may show that we were all united behind the things that we were doing, but that was really not the case. The society was severely split over the Vietnam War. It was severely split over whether to support the teacher strike in New York City, which you might remember had a whole racial dimension to it. And it was certainly split over student protests. If you're going to protest, shouldn't it be peaceful? What does it mean to violently protest? These were all very difficult, very difficult, and often acrimonious discussions, arguments, shouting at the society. Well, here I come in the fall, I start in the summer of 1967 under the at that time, Ross Weston was the leader. And then in spring in 1968, I get a telephone call coming out of the blue, as far as I knew, which was to say that the leader, Ross Weston, has resigned, and he's not even any longer present. He and his wife have gotten onto their small yacht, and they were off to the warmer climate in the Caribbean. And then they said, how would you like to be the leader? Well, April 1968, I was 24 years old. The salary that was being offered by the Long Island Society, probably subsidized by the American Ethical Union, was something less than $6,000 a year. And why did they ask me? Well, sometimes it was explicit, but often you had to read between the lines. I think basically it was because I was young. People thought that I would be better able to understand their own children. And again, remember, many of their children were protesting. They were in college. Some of them were involved in the Weathermen. And they said, well, maybe you could help us understand our children. Maybe you'd be able to talk to them or interpret them to us. And it was the times in which we lived, which were, as I said, there were racial elements to the controversies. And they said, well, after all, for 2 years, you lived in a foreign culture. Maybe you can understand things that we can't understand if you want to understand it and look at it in cultural terms. But here I was also a husband and a father. So there was some grounding to me, but I also had almost long hair. I rode a motorcycle, and I was fond of wearing dashikis. In fact, I didn't own a suit. When they asked me to become the leader, I had to go out and buy a suit, which I didn't wear for very long when I spoke at the society. I soon shed my suit to nice looking dashikis, which didn't make a lot of people particularly happy. Despite all of that, the society placed its confidence in me. And a year after appointing me in this very odd and unexpected way, it was officially endorsed by the American Ethical Union that, in fact, yes, I was the leader legitimately of the Long Island Society. Well, at that point, there was a member who said, you know what, I have a pair of boots that are older than you. And she was right. And here I was now almost immediately thrust into the life that I had to really think very hard about whether I wanted to adopt as part of my professional life, which is the life of a pastor. Because very, very quickly, people turned to me in that role. They turned to me for counseling. They provided confidences, very intimate confidences with me. And I heard what might be called confessions of infidelities, confessions of very serious crimes, including murder. I went on many, many hospital visits. And it was probably within the very first year that I was the leader of the society, I was called upon to officiate at my first funeral. And this was, I remember this very vividly, a 17-year-old high school student who died in a car accident.
Oh my.
Very quickly after that, I began to bury friends, strangers, members, non-members of the society, children, and the very old. Was also the first year I was the leader of the society that was called upon to officiate at weddings. And I remember, again, very clearly, the first wedding I officiated at. It was in a kitchen in a very small apartment in Staten Island. Those people who I didn't know before went on to become members of the society, and both of their children graduated from our Sunday school. Over the years, I went from this tiny apartment in Staten Island to officiate at a wedding to some of the toniest sections of the Hamptons, including on an estate that was looking at, oh God, what's her name? People live in the Hamptons. The name escapes me. But I mean, you can't get more expensive property anyplace in the world. So that was part of what I was doing. I became friends with some of the people whose weddings I officiated at. Most I never saw again, but I did officiate at weddings of friends, children of friends, and my own children. And in 1 year, I officiated at more than 60 weddings. And at some point, I counted up the number of weddings I had officiated at, and it was more than 1,000. I visited people at hospitals, and there was one thing that bothered me when I visited people at hospital. I mean, aside from seeing sick people, obviously, and it was that when somebody checked into a hospital, they often asked you your religion, and they would list the traditional religions. And I sometimes would have somebody from the society who say, look, what am I supposed to do here? It doesn't say ethical culture. It didn't even offer, none at that point. And, so one member said, I was raised Catholic and I really didn't know what I was doing. I wasn't really, not thinking clearly. I checked off Catholic. And ever since, I can't get rid of all of these priests who are coming to see me every day. So I took on as a task trying to get hospitals to change their forms to include at least other or none, and some of them actually adopted ethical culture as an option for people when they checked in. I want to talk about some just 3 things, I guess, that were social action projects that weren't mentioned in the video that were really very big and they were important, but didn't last very long. One of them was called the Wicklow Project. And this was a housing project in Hempstead that was really what you might call a slum. It was terrible. It was really, really very poorly maintained and occupied mainly by people who were really poor on welfare and so forth. What we did with people who lived in Hempstead, and some of them even lived in the project, we organized a community drive where we went around door to door asking people to tell us about the conditions in their apartments. And with that information, we mounted a campaign to change the conditions. It wound up as a major story in Newsday. One side effect of this, which was really unexpected, which created other kinds of problems. It turned out that the person who owned the project was a rabbi. So anti-Semitism sort of creeped into all of this. And the outcome was that a local church, a Baptist church that was right nearby, they decided to take over the project and ultimately created a co-op there. At the same time, we created an art gallery in Hempstead on Main Street that featured Black artists. And there was an article in Newsday about this with a photograph. However, when the Wicklow Project came to a crashing end, when we were called into when we were summoned to put an end to it by some other Black activist groups on Long Island, who then took out a pistol and laid it on the table and said, we strongly urge you to get out. Don't involve yourself in this any longer. The Wicklow Project for us came to an end, as did the art gallery. Second thing I want to talk about that's not in the video is a school that we created. This was a time that people were very concerned about reforming schools and education. So we created something that was called the Learning Tree. And the idea was that this was going to be a school that was really going to be run by parents, teachers, and children collectively. There was not going to be, there was no hierarchy involved, which I think probably we took a wrong tact here and decided, since none of us members of the society were involved in any one of those three ways, we would be sponsoring it at our society, house it at the society. That would be the schoolhouse, but we would not be supervising it. Well, the school ran into some problems. The kids were a little bit too rowdy, and the school left. They moved to a place in Westbury, where it continued for about 3 or 4 years after us. Some of the kids, I know of two, who graduated from the Learning Tree. One went on to become a chef in Maine, is still today, I hope he may be retired by now. And the other took over from his father, and he now is the director of probably the major art movie house on Long Island. The third project I want to talk about very quickly is the Jones Institute, which was, believe it or not, the poor house in Long Island in Nassau County. I began to teach poetry writing at the Jones Institute, saw the conditions that were there, and with the aid of mainly Joan Beater, we began to organize a way of trying to force the county, which was funding it, through a trust that had sufficient money to run it, to get them to actually run it properly, upgrade it, make people's lives fine. So Joan and I actually put together a book that was their poetry, Joan's photographs. Newsday picked up the story, ran an editorial in Newsday about what we were doing. We sued the county for them because when they announced that they were going to close it down, we said, you can't do that. Where's the money going to go? Where are these people going to go? Well, we lost the case. The Jones Institute now is a sort of an upscale, what do you call it? Not a living, yeah, maybe a living facility, someplace on the North Shore. I'm sure this was not a very good thing that happened here, but we did our best, and we certainly made a lot of noise about it. And I think, at least to some small extent, we gave some hope to the people who had lived there. Now, the other thing that when I came to the society bothered me, it's related to this question of being a pastor. I was very happy with all the social action projects we were doing. But the other element was related to being a pastor, which is calling it a religion and the religious terminology. And probably more than anything else with people who come to us, are interested in us, maybe even join us, is they don't want to talk about it as a religion. They don't want to hear about a religion. They are anti-religion. They hate religion. They didn't come here for that. They came for social action. They came for companionship. They came for other things, but not religion. And I believe it still bothers a lot of people, especially if you come out of a religious setting that for you was troubling both intellectually and emotionally. I had to reorient myself from being non-religious and somewhat critical of religion to calling myself a humanist minister, which I still do when I think of myself in the context of being the leader emeritus of the society. But in the 1960s, when I came, even within a wider ethical movement, religion wasn't the term that was used by many, many people. It had been equivocal early on. It sort of fell away in the 1930s. By the 1960s, when I came, rarely was it used. In the 1970s, it was being reintroduced again. When Felix Adler founded the ethical movement, he really had a very restricted sense of what religion was. And he also reserved it only to those who would adopt his narrow metaphysical view of the world. But those who came to the ethical movement who saw it not in his metaphysical terms, he said, well, it's a moral movement. You know, if you take his metaphysical view, it's religious. If you reject it, well, then it's a moral movement for you. But whichever way you looked at it, clearly what was important was how you live in the world that brings out the best in other people and in yourself, how we make the world better for others and ourselves. It is a faith in the possibility of moving towards a better life. And this faith in a better life is supremely important. That matters of right and wrong and how we live our lives is intensely important. It's intensely important to me. And it's that intensely important aspect of it that I take as being one aspect of what I mean by religion. The other aspect of what I mean by, for me, I'm perfectly happy talking about it as a religious institution, is that we perform the functions of a congregational religion. We have ceremonies around life cycles. I mentioned two of them. It's also a devotion to a way of life. It is holding ethical values dear and attempting to live them out. So week after week, on Sunday mornings, this is why we get together. It is to remind us of those values. It's to remind us of justice and compassion. It's to remind us about the importance of kindness and generosity. Adler says it's religious for those who are religious, moral for those who are moral. Adler's religious attitude said, somehow, this is a quote from Adler, somehow the secret of the universe is hidden in our breast. Somehow the destinies of the universe depend upon our exertions. Well, I think most of us today don't believe that the universe has a secret. And most of us reject the idea that the universe depends upon what we do. The universe is indifferent to us, but the earth isn't. What we do here in this world, the world that we inhabit, that very much depends upon what we do. So the ethical society, to me, is a place that inspires me. It infuses in me a devotion to making me a better person and continuing to hold me to creating a better world wherever I can, however I interact with it, however wide or narrow that interaction may be, however circumscribed my life may now be because of COVID restrictions or because of getting older or whatever it might be. Wherever I encounter the world, whoever I encounter it with, it is to try to make a better place and thereby make me a better person. Ethical movement, the ethical societies, our ethical religion, is a religion of relations. The relations that we have with family, friends, neighbors, nation, the world, and the natural world upon which everything depends. This past week, there was an op-ed piece in the New York Times written by Tish Warren, who was an Episcopal priest. I thought it was an interesting article, but there's just one thing I want to pick out from it that I will paraphrase it. But she asked this question. She said, is church, now substitute ethical society, is church more like going to a restaurant or to kindergarten? And what she means by this, and she explains it, I think, in the next sentence, she says, is church a nice perk, like going to a restaurant? Or is what you get there indispensable, like it is for children who go to a kindergarten? Now, it's an interesting image, interesting metaphor, but I change it a little bit. What the image for me is a breakfast table. I think of the ethical society like the breakfast table. When I am around the breakfast table, I get the strength for the rest of my day. Now, my breakfast could be simple, it could be elaborate. It could be in my house, it might be someplace else. It could be alone, it could be with other people. It's also a place not only for nutrition, but it's also a place for contemplation. It's a place for making plans. It's a place for gathering the news. It's a place, of course, to eat, and to eat well, to eat properly. And all of this is essential nourishment for living well. So the question I ask for you to consider, is the ethical society discretionary, like a restaurant, or is it essential, like the breakfast table? Is it challenging to you, or is it another form of entertainment? If it is essential, what makes it so? What happens if your friends are no longer here, or the friends that you've made in the society are now found elsewhere? Or if you move away, or if the society has moved away from you? Are you still a humanist, committed to its values, to its principles, and to its ideals? So I just want to conclude with these few thoughts, sketches, if you'd like. I ask you to have the courage to look life honestly and to do what needs to be done. I hope that you find the comfort to heal the wounds of hardship, setbacks, and tragedies. And this can be a place that can help provide that comfort. And I hope it's a place where you can find companionship to hold out your hand, to have others hold out their hands to you, where our hearts can be shared with one another. And this is a place that can make those bonds stronger. In the ethical movement, we tend to talk a lot. Everything seems to be like a mini series on television that goes on for years, or a saga. But every once in a while, some leader or somebody who is in a leadership position creates a haiku for us. I want to end with a recent haiku from Mike French, who is from the Baltimore area and an ethical culture leader. He summarized everything about ethical humanism this way. He didn't write it as a poem. He didn't call it a haiku. Those are my terms for it. He says, it comes down to three things. All living things are connected. My behavior counts. Act on the basis of the first two sentences. Thank you.